Okay, so welcome, Spies and Espionage of World War II. Um, Before we get started, I'm going to go over a little bit of definitions because not everyone may know what some words mean. Um, Espionage is just the act of an individual to collect military or political intelligence on an enemy state or group. It doesn't necessarily have to be an individual employed by a different state. It just is the act of collecting. Spies are usually those who participate in espionage who are employed by a state. Not always. I guess you could be a spy without being employed by a state, but usually it's employed by a state. All right, we're going to start off with a little background. So the invasion of France in 1940. We will be talking mostly about France because that's mostly where this whole espionage thing started. So the whole reason Germany invaded France was one, because it's the largest threat to German expansion in World War II. France had the largest standing army in mainland Europe. It also had the most technological advanced army in mainland Europe. On top of that, it controlled massive amounts of colonies overseas, mostly in Africa and Southeast Asia. This provided France with a large amount of resources. Taking France would take those resources away from the Allies and give it to Hitler or the Nazis. There was also a huge animosity towards France for what happened in World War I. France completely humiliated Germany at the end of World War I, forcing them to sign the armistice. And they're the biggest factor behind those those consequences that Germany faced. So in May 10th, Nazi forces started their blitzkrieg. So let me turn on this. All right. Okay. So if you guys can see my mouse now, this horn right here on this top map, that was the Maginot Line, and France built that after World War I to stop any invasion coming from the east. Well, Hitler decided he didn't like that, so he went north instead. And he just went around it. And that was devastating to France because all of their forces were behind that Maginot Line. And these arrows represent the ways that the German A, B, C, and C army went. And they basically took over all of France within a couple days, a couple months. And on June 4th, or May 26th, they trapped all the Allied troops in the village of Dunkirk. And on June 4th, all remaining Allied forces that were already captured or killed evacuated England. And that was the end of mainland Europe, or free mainland Europe. This bottom map represents the occupied zone and the Vichy zone. The Vichy zone is known as the free zone, but it definitely wasn't free. It was still under fascist rule, and the Vichy government was more of a puppet government than anything else. They were completely controlled by the Nazis, and everything that happened in occupied territory happened in Vichy territory, with the only exception that Vichy France was a little bit more lenient when it came to imprisoning its own people. So that is what happened. And this whole thing left England alone. Because if we can all recall, the United States didn't join the war until 1942. So after the evacuation of Dunkirk, England was the only country pretty much standing against Nazi Germany at the time, and it looked pretty bleak. They had no way to get over the channel to Germany to take the fight to them, and they were stuck on an island. To make matters worse, Germany's U-boat fleets kept resources from coming in from all of England's colonies. England tried to petition the United States for help. However, the president said no, he didn't want to send more American lives into another European war. So they said no, and instead he gave them, I think it was 500 planes, and that was about it. This made Churchill realize something. He cannot win or even fight in mainland Europe by any conventional means. So he decided to come up with a new type of warfare, and he called that warfare ungentlemanly. It was frowned upon by basically everyone at the time. And he petitioned the army to come up with a new division or a new, my mind just blanked, a new section of the army, let's say, to carry out setting Europe ablaze. And this is the birth of the ungentlemanly warfare. The answer to this was the Army's Special Operations Executive, or SOE. And it was Churchill's pet project, mainly because no one else liked the idea. And Churchill was all about it. His goal with this was collect intelligence for the eventual invasion of France, because everyone knew in Allied command that France would be the way to go if they were to strike at Germany. There was no real other attack route. If you went through Italy, you'd have the problem of going over the Alps. And if you went straight into Germany, you'd have the problem of running into the Atlantic line. So it was the only option for them. The only problem with this was that there were no able-bodied men left. They were either already enlisted in the army defending England or over in the colonies. And the SOE, the head of command, decided, hey, well, there's no men left. Well, why not? Let's get women fighting. And nobody liked this idea, except for Churchill. Churchill thought this was a great idea. Women were already in civilian corps, aiding the army, the air forces, and the navies. So he said, go ahead. The only problem was Parliament said no. So in response to this, the SOE created the Fanny Corps, or the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. Sorry, it's a weird word. And this was a cover just to accept women in the SOE. So in 1940, by the end of 1940, the first woman went through clandestine training and explosives training and special weapons training. The SOE divided their sections based on where they were, what country they were. So F section operated in France, N section Netherlands, and T section Poland, and so on. Any questions so far? Guys, questions or any thoughts on what's happening? No? Okay, well then this might be a shorter class than I thought. All right, so let's move on. We're going to just go over some of the people that participated in this. The first one is George Bigyou. He was the first F section SOE agent to be recruited and dropped into France. He was a French soldier before the war broke out, and when Germany invaded France, he fled to England. He enlisted with England and volunteered for SOE service soon after. And on May 5th, 1941, he parachuted into the Centre-Val-de-Loire region of France. And he parachuted blind because there was no one there to help him. He was a radio operator, and this picture in the middle, that's the radio he used. It was made small enough to be put in a briefcase. And the picture on the right is George himself. And in order to get help, he made a deal with the leader of the socialist resistance movement there, which later became the communist and the Marxist movements in France, but they were allies at this time. Almost immediately, the Gestapo and the German police caught on to what he was doing. They picked up his radio signal, started jamming it, so this forced them to move from place to place. And on October 3rd, only a couple months after he landed, a fellow agent, I forgot to put the name there. Okay, sorry about that. But a fellow agent was arrested and gave up the address for his safe house. And the Gestapo converged on Marseille, and he was arrested. And he escaped in 1942 with the help of Virginia Hall, who we'll talk about a little bit, and made his way back to England after being imprisoned in Spain for a couple months because they thought he was a fascist spy, which is kind of ironic because he was spying on fascists. So Liste Bassac, she was pretty incredible woman. She was one of the first SOE agents to be trained. She graduated the first class along with another woman named Andre Borel and Odette Sanson. Her and Andre were dropped into France in 1942, the first woman to be parachuted into enemy territory. And instead of being a usual radio operator, which is what most of the jobs were when you became an SOE agent, she was tasked with creating her own resistance network. These networks were given different names, such as Prosper or Scientist, or I believe there was a hospital network too in France. There were a total of 90 different networks in France. Now, most of them had a woman at the head of their command. If not leading it, they were the second command. And this was true with these two. She originally dropped in as a poor widow and an amateur archaeologist, which gave her pretty much a free pass to travel around the countryside. The Nazis didn't believe that a poor widow would be a spy. They thought it wouldn't happen. And her cover as an archaeologist gave her the rights to go digging around wherever she wanted, basically. She formed a very successful resistance movement known as Prosper with the help of Andre. And but then the Gestapo found out about her, and they started hunting her. And this was really bad for Elise because her safe house was across the street from Gestapo headquarters. So she decided to come back to England, uh, and she got there, successfully debriefed, and started training new agents. On one of the training jumps, she broke her leg and was out of the war for another year. However, on April 10th, 1944, she was sent back to France and met up with her brother, where they ran the scientist network together. This took the place of half of Prosper's area after it fell, and it was the one where the Allied invasion was. It controlled Normandy. And during this, it was absolutely vital that the scientist network was there with the resistance movement, because if it wasn't, the SS Panzer divisions would have gotten to Normandy within a day of the invasion and completely pushed back the Allied invasion force back into the Channel. But they pretty much stopped in its tracks for the next couple months. They destroyed trains, blew up roadways, bridges, tunnels, even attacked the Panzer divisions themselves. And Eisenhower even commented on the scientist network, saying that without them, the invasion would have failed and the war would have dragged on for months, if not years more. She was awarded the Resistance Cross, I believe it was, by France, and a couple other medals by England. And I put Andre in there because I just think her story is fascinating as well as very tragic. She was captured when Prosper Network fell, and she was tortured and interrogated for years, never once giving up any information about fellow agents or the invasion. And eventually in 1945, with the Allies coming to Germany, the SS running the concentration camp where she was decided that she was too much of a risk, poisoned her, but not enough, and she woke up trying to fight her way out, but was eventually killed. She was awarded the George Cross posthumously, and she's been celebrated ever since. So, oh no, that wasn't Virginia. That was Lise. So it took the whole year for her leg to heal from 1943 to 1944. But yeah, it healed and she got back to France and helped the invasion. Why is it left out of history classes? Well, I mean, most espionage stuff is left out of history classes. It was left out for a long time because people still didn't believe that women should be on the front lines, but they were, and it's kind of unfair because they were still considered civilians, so they weren't able to get military honors when they came back. That was changed late 20th century, early 2000s, and has since been corrected. Yeah, it took a long time for people to accept it, unfortunately. Actually, it's funny, most of this is about women in the SOE because most of the spies were women, because all the men were either on the front line or too old to fight. So women did a lot of the the backbreaking work, so to speak, when it came to espionage in World War II. The unprosperous Prosper network. When it first started, it was the most successful network and the biggest too. It participated in hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of, I guess you could call it terrorism throughout its borders. It blew up train tracks, power plants, power lines, train tunnels, roads. At one point, it even blew up an entire factory producing ammo for the Nazi army. And at its height, it had 10,000 resistance fighters and spies. However, pretty early on, it seems it was infiltrated by a double agent working for the German counterintelligence. And by pretty early on, I mean within the first couple months. The only reason it didn't fall is because this agent's goal, Henry Dericourt, his goal was to find out the date and time of the invasion, not actually bring down the Prosper network. What happened is that there was a courier on a train who fell asleep, and his briefcase full of all the sensitive information was taken. And then when he got off the train, he was arrested. He was tortured and tricked into thinking that he was helping the Prosper network by giving up their location. And this resulted in the worst failure of SOE during the entire war. Pretty much the entire Prosper network was either killed or captured. And the Gestapo and the SS captured a radio operator. I didn't put his name in there because, frankly, I can't pronounce it. He was Serbian, I believe it was, and his name's very long. I can't say it, so I didn't put it in. But he got captured, and they took his radio. They sent a message back to SOE headquarters, and he tried to give them a warning that the Prosper network fell by not putting in one of his checks. Every radio operator had 2 checks to know that, for SOE to know that it was actually them, not someone else, or if they weren't transmitting under duress. So he purposely didn't put in one of his checks. The commander in charge of the Fannies operating the radios didn't believe the Fanny radio operator when she said that it wasn't him. And instead, he sent back a message saying, "Remember your 2 checks. Don't let it happen again." This completely baffled the radio operator, and he decided that the English were too stupid to work with anymore, and he switched sides and started working for the SS and started the radio games, where the Germans tricked England into thinking Prosper was still operational. So they parachuted hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of ammunition, guns, and explosives, and even agents into Prosper area, where they were just immediately captured by German police. Any questions about the Prosper network? In this map over here, so the bottom, so how many people survived from that network in the end? I don't know exactly, but of the commanding structure, is believed that only 2 of them survived. We'll talk about those 2. I think that's the next slide. Actually, they're pretty important people. But this map right here, on the left where Bordeaux is, that's the scientist network. And then the whole northern section where Cherbourg, Normandy, Dunkirk area, that is the Prosper network. After Prosper network fell, the scientist network extended to where Dieppe is, up in the north between Cherbourg and Dunkirk. So, any other questions? Okay. So, Odette Sansom. That's a picture of Odette, and we'll talk about that guy next to her in a second. So, Odette was another one of the first SOE female agents trained. But due to her age, she wasn't parachuted to France. She was sent a year later than Andre and Lise by boat to southern France. There she met up with a guy, Peter Churchill, who has no relation to Winston Churchill, and the radio operator, which is the same radio operator I just finished talking about. And they set up the Spindle Network. And they successfully ran the Spindle Network, which was around central France or southeastern, next to the Alps. And it was a pretty successful one. The only problem is that the native French population there didn't really want to work with the British. And that was due pretty much to the animosity when France got taken over. England immediately bombed all of their harbors and train stations, killing a lot of French military and even French civilians. So the French people there didn't really want to work with them. However, despite that, it was still a pretty successful operation. But when the Prosper network fell, her safe house was revealed to German police. And a German spy came posing as a major, saying that he wanted to switch sides and work for England. And by doing this, he was led straight to Odette and Peter. And from there on, he alerted the police, and they came and arrested both of them. They were immediately sent to Paris, where they were imprisoned and tortured in very unpleasant ways. However, Odette realized something, that Peter's last name is Churchill. So she decided to make up a story. Since they already covered as being married, she decided to tell the SS and the Gestapo there that Peter was Winston Churchill's nephew. And this completely saved Peter's life. He was close to death and slotted for execution. However, after she said this, they transferred him to an Italian prison in Italy, where he was treated more as a guest than a prisoner. Odette was not so lucky. However, she was still saved by her story, and she was sent to a women's prison camp in Germany. During her time there, she was constantly interrogated. The guards refused to give her food and water for days on end. She wouldn't see the outside for weeks or months. She became very sickly and close to death. The only thing that saved her was her story about her being the adopted niece, I guess you could say, of Winston Churchill. Because of this, when the Allies were coming into Germany, the commandant of the prison took her as a bargaining chip and drove to the front lines, found the Americans, and said that he was returning Winston Churchill's niece out of good faith. Odette immediately said that he was the commander of a concentration camp, and the Americans immediately arrested him and sent him away. But because of her bravery and her cleverness in saving Peter Churchill, and not only that, but the entire Spindle network, she was awarded the George Cross, which is the second highest award given to anyone in England, an English citizen. And she was the most decorated SOE female agent they would ever have. Later on, she got a divorce from her original husband, married Peter, lived happily ever after until they got divorced and she got remarried. So, any questions about Odette? Yes, there are some movies based on these spies. There aren't really Hollywood movies. I would say they're mostly either English or French movies. You can find the English versions on like Amazon Prime and stuff. I've watched a couple. They're pretty good, but they're very embellished. I've never seen that movie. She was pretty cool. She was also a mother of 3 when she left. So she was sacrificing a lot more than just her life, as she could have made her children parentless. Now we're going to talk about Virginia Hall, the only American that is in this presentation, but probably my favorite. Not because of that. Virginia Hall has a very interesting story. She was born wealthy into a banking family on the East Coast of the United States. However, she hated being at home, and she had a really good gift for languages. She spoke multiple languages by the end of her life. And early on, she decided she wanted to go see the world. So she signed on with diplomatic envoys. She went to Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and even Turkey. And when she was in Turkey, she went on a hunting trip and she suffered an injury and she had to lose her right leg, I believe it was, at the age of 27. After that, she was sent back to Italy as a clerk. She absolutely hated her job as a clerk, so she quit and just started traveling around Europe. And then when World War II, no, she didn't. Partly because she traveled with the envoys, but she didn't become an actual diplomat. She was refused a couple times, and then after she lost her leg, she said she couldn't be a diplomat because of that. So when World War II broke out, she was in France, and she decided to become a ambulance driver. So she drove ambulances for the French army for a couple months until the France fell. And after France fell, she traveled south, hiked over the Pyrenees Mountains with a prosthetic leg, which back then wasn't very good. It was a wooden leg, and made it to Spain. From there, she went to England and she signed on with the SOE. And on August 23rd, 1941, she arrived in Vichy, France, where she immediately started doing her thing. She worked alone most of the time. She formed resistance movements, carried out demolition missions, even assassination missions. She worked as a radio operator, a courier, and and she helped, due to her network of contacts and safe houses, she was the number one go-to for any Allied pilot that went down in France, or POWs. She transported them to neutral Spain, from there back to England. Her cover story was a New York Post reporter. This gave her special access to places where civilians couldn't go. She got to talk to high-ranking Nazi officials, Vichy officials, collaborators. Pretty much anyone wasn't out of reach for her because of this cover. And at first, people wouldn't believe that she was a spy because of her leg. However, this changed in 1941 in late 1941, because she heard of 12 agents, SOE agents, who were captured and sent to prison in Malzac prison in southern France. This is the same prison where George, the first agent we talked about, was sent. And with the help of his wife and a priest, Virginia Hall was able to smuggle in a radio and multiple tins of sardines, which inside of them were hidden lock-picking tools and key-making tools. This allowed the agents to transmit radio messages from inside the prison, which was a pretty good cover because the SS and the Gestapo didn't think anyone would do that. In 1942, she finally helped them escape, and by herself, she led them to safety through her chain of safe houses and contacts, and got them to Spain and back to England. This is when the Gestapo kind of got onto her. And because of the invasion of North Africa, Germany no longer tolerated Vichy France. They took over everything. All of France was occupied by the end of 1942. And Virginia Hall became the number one wanted agent by the Gestapo, the SS, and the German police. So she escaped, made her way back to England. When she got to England, she heard about the newly formed OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and they contacted her, got her on, and in 1944, they sent her back to France to work as a radio operator and a courier, where she continued the resistance fight. She is the only female to have been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the highest intelligence medal you could have caught back then. And yeah, she's a pretty cool person. Any questions about Virginia Hall? Nothing. Then we're going to move on to Christina Scarbeck. This is the only person we're going to talk about who wasn't operating in France at the time. She was born into Polish royalty, and when Poland was invaded by the Soviets and the Nazis, she was already in London on a trip with her family. Hearing about the invasion of Poland, she got fired up, tried to enlist multiple times in the army, trying to go back and free Poland. They denied her because she is a woman, and they didn't want women on the front line. However, she heard about SOE and she signed on with them. And there she came up with the plan to ski in Poland during the winter and deliver British propaganda. And at this point, SOE didn't have any plan to go to Poland because Poland already had its own resistance movement going. They absolutely refused to collaborate with Nazi Germany, unlike France, and SOE didn't really see a use for sending agents into Poland. However, she convinced them, and she convinced an Olympic skier to lead her over the mountains. That winter was the coldest winter on record, and during the spring thaw, the Nazis found so many frozen bodies of people trying to escape that they tripled their patrols the next winter. There, she was absolutely vital to the operations in Poland. She smuggled intel, saved the lives of other people, carried out assassination missions. She worked as a radio operator. Basically, anything an SOE agent could do, she did it. Probably because there were very few of them there, and she was probably the most capable of all of them. It was said that she was Churchill's favorite spy, which I could see because of how good she was, and she's actually the inspiration behind all the female spies in the James Bond movies. Fun fact. And at one point, to save a fellow agent as well as a love interest of hers, she walked around a prison in the middle of the night singing a song. Okay, so what do I mean by Poland refused to cooperate? So France was given half of France to the Vichy government, which technically was still controlled by France, and they were told they could keep their colonies, although they had to pay, I think it was 70% to Germany. So the French people didn't necessarily see any reason to have a resistance movement in southern France. But Poland, before they were even taken over, they created their own kind of spy network within it, within the capital. And they hated the idea of being occupied much more than France did. They attacked the Soviets, Nazis alike. They hated them both. So England just kind of thought, we'll let them do their thing. We won't join in. Well, Christina changed her mind on that. But to go on about this agent she wanted to free, she walked around singing this song, and she didn't stop until she heard him reply with the next verse. After that, she just walked straight through the front door of the prison, posing as a relative to a British diplomat, and told him that the Allies were at the city's limits, and the only way to receive any kind of leeway with their treatment, I guess, was to let every single prisoner go. And they bought it. They opened all the doors, let them all go, and soon realized that the Allies weren't even close. And in fact, they had only landed at Normandy, and they were a couple countries away. So that was a pretty cool story. I read about. All right, we're here to talk about one of the most important SOE operations, I believe. I call it the Norwegian monster because that's what the Norwegians called it. But in 1939, Nazi Germany set up as a kind of a secret organization to start developing and looking into nuclear weaponry, and they're with an overarching goal of building an atomic bomb. However, Germany didn't have access to heavy water, and the graphite to refine plutonium wasn't available back then in large numbers, so heavy water was their only choice. So in April of 1940, the Nazis invaded Norway, both in an effort to secure their northern border against England and capture the crucial heavy water facilities that Norway had at the time. It was one of the only countries that had these facilities, so it was the only option for the Nazis in order to develop their nuclear weapons. Pretty soon, in 1941, Allies heard about this, and they started trying to destroy these facilities through a series of bombing raids and commando operations. The first one, Operation Freshman, was a complete failure, resulting in 3 aircraft shot down, all 39 commandos killed, plus an additional 2 Norwegian commandos. Eventually, SOE got involved, and they decided to send a couple agents, worked with Norwegian commandos, and they were able to stop production and prevent the development of Nazi atomic weaponry. A couple of historians debate on this, that even if they did fail completely during the entire war to stop this, that the Nazis wouldn't have been able to build one. Other historians say that if they didn't do this, then the Nazis would have been able to develop an atomic bomb either before or around the same time the United States did, which would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. Any questions about that? Okay, so heavy water, I forget the actual like chemical name for it, but so with every so often when you get a molecule of heavy water, there's an additional piece to it. I forget what it's called. Shame on me. But heavy water is just basically, it has a higher concentration of that certain piece, and it's called D2O instead of H2O, and it allows for a faster and better refinement of plutonium-239, I believe it is. So it can help produce atomic weapons. Nowadays we use hyper purified graphite, but they didn't have that back then. So heavy water was kind of their only option. Any other questions? No. Okay, so that is actually the end of my slideshow.